Welcome to this launch of Joanna's book on the 200 years of Birkbeck, which of course is published to commemorate our 200 years. We had last week the Foundation Day dinner for the 199th anniversary, so we're now in the 200th anniversary year. And of course, many universities and many bodies produce histories of their times and whatever, written by historians and so on. Most of them are incredibly boring and say things like, and then another department that was opened was, and another professor that was appointed was. Sometimes, however, they're very interesting, and that is because when the university has to apologize unreservedly to somebody for something that's printed in the book. I was just looking at one from a university in London where they had to send around a letter apologizing unreservedly and sending you 2 copies of a sticker to stick into the 2 pages where this terrible error about somebody had been made. And of course, what people do, at least what I do, is then immediately turn to those pages to see exactly what is going on those 2 pages. Now you understand why I gave Joanna entirely free rein in producing this work and did not interfere in any way whatsoever, because of course, if anybody would like to write to me saying they've been misrepresented in this book or misjudged or whatever it is, I shall just tell them to pass on their views to Professor Burke and not to me. So that, I think, is very clear. And of course, those of you who've read the book and those of you who are going to get it, hopefully this evening, it is not in that mold. It is not dull, as far as I can see, doesn't insult anybody, certainly doesn't insult me, which is nice. And I think it's something where you read it through, certainly in my view, and you think, that theme's interesting, that's a nice theme, and whatever. And then at the end, you actually realize that she's covered everything in the history of Birkbeck through those themes, rather than through this terrible, and in 1957, Professor X was appointed and so on. So it really is, I think, a tremendous work. It is something that I think will serve as a wonderful model for university history. So we're going to have a bit of a talk now, but afterwards, the most important thing is go and get the book and get it signed. But in the meantime, I will hand over to our esteemed author and to Professor Matt Cook to speak to her and discuss matters with her. And after that, we're going to hear anecdotes from the book. So something very exciting to look forward to. Enjoy.
Thank you, David. Thanks, David. Thanks everyone for coming. Joanna gave me a copy of the book last week, and she said, this is a book to dip into. Not realizing that to dip into this book, as into any of Joanna's books, is actually to get completely sucked in. And I want to give a really quick example. So I turned to chapter 25 on teaching, which begins at nearly every interview for a lectureship at the college in recent decades. The same question is asked, and in fact, I got asked this question too. What would you do if you walked into a seminar room on a bleak winter evening and were faced with a dozen weary civil servants, teachers, clerks, homemakers, taxi drivers, and accountants? When, in 1991, Tessa Blackstone, the first and so far the only female master, never mistress, of Birkbeck, asked me this question at my interview, I quipped, "Sex and violence should get them going." I meant, of course, the history of gender and war topics I was researching at the time. A stony silence descended on the room.
But they did appoint me.
They did appoint you. But who could stop there, having read this opening? And so pages along, I'd learnt about flamboyant, squeaky, pipe-smoking philosopher Cyril Mitchison. I'd read about historian Eric Hobsbawm, who had, according to one, the studied inelegance of the British Old Left, and the much smarter physicist Frederick Cheshire, who appeared in lectures in top hat and tails. And amidst and on the back of these sketches, we get in this chapter a really brilliant, I think, evocation of what's been extraordinary about Birkbeck teaching and scholarship, and the deep connection between the two. And what it was, in fact, that kept the civil servants, homemakers, taxi drivers, and all coming on those dark nights. You can tell already that this is a really hugely engaging, endlessly fascinating book, and it gives, I think, a really rich, cogent, and convincing account of what it is that's unique about this place anchored in vivid case studies, capturing its spirit and mission. But centrally, it's really a story of people. People who studied here against all sorts of incredible odds, who worked here in all sorts of capacities, not just as academics, and people who in various ways remind me of Joanna. Because starting in 1991, as she said, they did, thank goodness, give her the job, despite the quip. And now on the cusp of retiring in 2 weeks' time, Joanna has exemplified the rigour, commitment, compassion, passion, great good humour, and sense of mission of so many who've passed through the college. And of course, now the college is going through incredibly difficult times, as many of you will know. And I have to say that reading this book this week really helped me, because this isn't the kind of history that's sadly saying, look what we've lost. But instead it's history as a forum for thinking about a way forward. And I think that's very much the kind of spirit in which this story, this history is told. And so it's really a pleasure, Joanna, to be here with you on this stage and to get the chance to discuss Birkbeck 200 years of radical learning for working people. And I think the first thing I wanted to ask is, it's massive and it's a huge endeavour. So can you tell us about the challenges of writing this book, researching and writing this book?
I hate these occasions because, basically you said everything so much more eloquently than I ever could. So, we should really just go and have a glass of wine now. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your comments. I mean, this is not the kind of history I write.
No, exactly.
And, for those of you who don't know, I write about violence. I write about dismembering men. I write about intimate history of killing, war, violence of all kinds, sexual violence. And so, it was really strange for me to sort of take on such a project. But, I took it on for lots of reasons, but the main one being that, I've been a Birkbeckian for a very long time. Thank you for telling the date. My goodness, it does age me a very long time. And I'm a Birkbeckian because I really loved this place. Mm-hmm. And I think, there were lots of challenges, though, as you can imagine, trying to write a history of 200 years of an institution, not only because it's not my kind of history, but also because it's generally boring. And, if there's anything I don't want to be, it's boring, at least not, if I can help it. So I guess the first question, though, was, well, who are my readers? And I know full well that, a lot of my readers are going to be alumni, they're going to be students, they're going to be people who've worked here in the past, they're going to be people who've had some contact with the college. And so, of course, that really creates a problem, because what is the first thing they're going to do? They're going to turn to the index to see if their name is there, or their favorite, lecturer, or their favorite discipline. Mm-hmm. So that was a real challenge. So I actually state quite explicitly in the book that I'm going to be extremely parsimonious about talking about living people, because otherwise I'm going to lose so many of my friends, who's not in the index. So that was a real challenge. But there's also a challenge of the actual archive. And, I probably shouldn't confess this, but, I had worked on this book for quite a few months, about 6-7 months. And before I was talking to someone about the college, and as she was leaving, she'd been at Birkbeck for a very long time. She was an elderly former professor. And as she was leaving the room, after an hour and a half's discussion, she just turned back and she said, she says, I'm hoping you're enjoying the archive at Ely. No one had mentioned that actually the main Birkbeck, or a main Birkbeck archive, was in Ely. So this was a bit of a shock, because there is an archive here in Mallet Street, which has the really very conventional papers for the college, the minute books and the kind of things that people who are writing boring history really need. So I ended up going to Ely, to this massive warehouse. And inside this massive warehouse, there were these shipping containers packed, just one box on top of each other, packed with the most exquisite primary material. And those of you here who are historians will know the shudder of joy that courses through our bodies when that happens. So I spent perhaps a year, going to Ely, this forklift truck would put these huge shipping trolleys in the middle of a lorry park. And I would work in a lorry park, sun, shine, whatever, rain, going through this material. And, I just loved it because it enabled me to write a fuller history of the college. Not simply a history of the top people, but a history of all of us that make up this great community. So that was great. That was a real highlight. But you mentioned, Matt, going through hard times now, the college. One thing that historians are notoriously bad at is predicting the future. In fact, a very famous colleague who I think is in the room, so I won't name him or her, he wrote this wonderful, very famous historian, wrote this wonderful history of Germany. And in it, he says, the Berlin Wall will never go down in my lifetime. I think it was a couple of weeks later. So I'm in good company of not being able to predict the future. But I do think, as you say, that, I hope at least that the history will show just why it's important to fight for our college, our community, why we are such a radical, unique, transformative place. And I hope that that's a good message, I think, to get across.
Absolutely. I was wondering about the kind of, that you kind of immersed yourself in Birkbeck in this lorry park in Ely. And I was thinking about this span of time and what larger stories you can tell through Birkbeck. What are the kind of shifts, cultural, social shifts that you identify through this kind of focused study of a particular place, of our place?
Yeah. I think that was the other thing that I was determined to ensure happened in this book, that, it is a history of a college that I love, a college that is so valuable, but it sheds a light on much broader questions that we're all concerned with. It sheds light obviously on the history of education. That's obvious, and the history of how politics has an impact on education and educational policies, and how politics has an impact on how we all live our lives within educational institutions. But it also sheds light on so many other things, such as diet. So I deal a lot with, what did people eat and drink? Why are they eating and drinking these things? How does that change over time? It tells a lot about gender relations. Tells a lot about minoritized communities within London. It tells us about this whole society in which we're living. So it's a sort of a case study that can enable me to reflect on some of those bigger questions. And that's what I think gave me the energy to write this book, because I could think more broadly about these other questions.
And did your sense of Birkbeck shift in the process?
Absolutely. Well, look, for those of you who don't know, 1823, obviously, it's 200 years. And, I started out, Birkbeck was known as the London Mechanics Institution. And basically, it's an institution that was established, technically, by a handful of white, older men. So for me, again, this was a different experience for me. So we have, for example, in terms of the founders of London Mechanics Institution, we have Joseph Robertson, who was a patent editor, patent officer and editor, a real rogue of a character, always going bankrupt and enjoying blackmailing people. But he was also the editor of the Mechanics magazine. We have Hodgkinson, who really incredible person, who a radical political economist, who Karl Marx admitted that he stole the idea of the labor theory of value from Hodgkin. Marx attended his lectures here in the college and said that Hodgkin is the greatest socialist economist. That's Karl Marx said that. Okay, not me. We have Francis Place, who's actually my favorite of our founders. Francis Place, the radical tailor of Charing Cross, who was deeply in love with his wife, who was a former servant, Elizabeth. Now remember, this is 1823, and Francis Place is advocating free love, sex before marriage, the need for young people to have lots of sex, birth control. His wife, Elizabeth, was always in bad health because she had too many children. So the radical tailor of Charing Cross. Then we have Lord Brougham, you know, one of the great, he became Lord Chancellor of Britain. And of course, we've got George Birkbeck, Quaker, doctor, great philanthropist, who basically lent his name, his status, and his skills to the London Mechanics Institution. So those are the main founders. We also have one which, as an historian, you won't appreciate this. He's technically not a founder, but I want to include him, and that's Ravenscroft, Francis Ravenscroft, because if it wasn't for him, we would have died. London Mechanics Institute would not have survived the 1840s. And I want to include him as one of our, technically not a founder, but he's up there. He was at Birkbeck 50 years and basically led the institution. So these are our founders. And, you know, I kept thinking to myself, where are the women? I
was just about to ask.
Where are the women? They're not there. Well, they are there, in fact. They are sequestered in ladies' rooms, as they call them, at the time, in the parlors, in the beds of these great white men. But, you know, they are a unique group of people. And to come to your question, you know, one of the things that was so important for me was, okay, we take these great founders, where do we go from there? How do we find alternative stories? How do we find out, you know, who actually created the London Mechanics Institution, who actually gave it breath, made it breathe? And of course, these are our students. At the time, they were not called students, they were called members. But these are the people who sort of breathed life into this institution and continue to do so.
And how did that body of students, how did student life change across this period?
Well, student life changed dramatically. If you look at women in particular, I mean, the London Mechanics Institution admitted women before any women's colleges existed. In fact, women's colleges didn't exist for another 10 years. We admitted women in 1830. Okay, I have to make a confession here. I'm saying we. We did admit women in 1830 to all of our classes. We did, though, make them go around the back door. We wouldn't let them in the front door until the 1890s. Wow. So let's just, okay. This is a warts and all history, and there's a huge number of warts in this book. But I think, that is illustrative of, how important our students, our members are. And, there are wonderful stories about women at Birkbeck. My favorite, do I have time to tell you my favorite?
Tell me your favorite.
Edith Lanchester, who was this new woman in the 1890s, who came to Birkbeck and did classes in the sciences. And she was there's great descriptions of her as sort of being boyish, and she wears her cap and she walks with her hands in her pockets. This is a negative thing, by the way. And she's got cropped hair. And she came to Birkbeck to do science because she wanted to have an independent career. And she fell in love at Birkbeck. with a guy called Seamus Thompson, I think it is. Anyway, and she decided, and she was one of the leading members of the Social Democratic Federation, early socialist party, okay? So she decided one day that she was going to live in sin with her beau. And so they were about to set up house. And what then happens? Well, the father is not happy with this, so he brings in what they used to call an alienist, which is the early term for a psychiatrist, to come to commit her into an insane institution on the grounds that she has been overeducated at Birkbeck. And I just want to read you out just a little piece here of what he said. So this is, for those of, I know there's some historians of medicine here. So this is George Fielding Blandford. One day, him and the parents and the sons come into her house the day before she's moving in to live in sin with this man. And he notes that Lanchester could give no reason for this conduct, moving in, beyond saying that marriage was immoral. She also said that if she married, she would lose her independence. I pointed out that if she had children and was deserted, she would have very little independence. But she only replied that he would not desert her. So she was taken away screaming. They took her into a carriage and she broke the window with her feet. And they took her to an insane asylum. And in the register, cause, and that is committing she's social suicide, overeducated here at Birkbeck. So she's one of, the people who, the new woman who really just used our college as a stepping stone to an independent life. She was released, by the way, after a few days, but never spoke to her family again. And she became a leading suffragette, and had lived with her man. His name was Sullivan, Seamus Sullivan. Lived with him in sin, never married, had 2 children, and she was right. He never deserted her. And one of her daughter was the actress who became the bride of Frankenstein. Yes, so a lovely, lovely story. He never deserted her. She died aged 95, a socialist and a feminist and a suffragette to the very, very end. But there are lots of, it's a lovely story. Yeah. But there's so many women here at Birkbeck. I mean, the other ones is, Annie Besant was a student here, was treated very badly, I have to say, David, by the management. Yes, by the management. But lots of other people. So, how it changes. Not only do our students change, but the whole nature of the institution, the way we deal with minoritized people, the way we deal with women have changed really dramatically over the period.
But what you're identifying too is some continuity in terms of this kind of, I'm sensing this kind of, what comes across in the book is this kind of enduring radical edge, which is which does feel like a thread through the college's history.
Yeah, and there is this radical edge. When I was, decided to write this, was asked to write this history, the first thing, being a contrary type person, was I'm going to break the myths of Birkbeck as being radical and different, and, I'm going to change the narrative. But, the more I looked into Birkbeck, the more I explored its students, its staff, the more actually a very, very different story. Not a different story, a story of different kinds of radicalism, different kinds of sort of pushing at the boundaries. I could map out in really lovely ways. And I do, I have to say this is, to reiterate that this is not only a story of students and lecturers and administrative staff. This is also a story of people who feed us, caterers, the cleaners, the porters, as they used to be called, the animal cage cleaners. I have a whole chapter on animals because I'm really interested in the history of animals. It's a story of the whole, who makes up our community,
the ecosystem of it,
without which we can't do what we're doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Where were the surprises?
There were lots of surprises. I guess surprising about, for example, the role of Birkbeck people in LGBTQ.
Okay.
Sort of pushing forward reforms. It's often quite radical reforms there. So unknown people who in fact changed the way, were very instrumental in decriminalizing homosexuality, for example, in private, for example. There were surprises about the crises around, for example, the two cultures. For those of you here who know about the two cultures debate, Snow's debate about the two cultures, science and the arts, and how they do or do not interact. There were surprises about what people found important in being a thinker. So, just to give one example, the role of sport, the role of theatre in creating a whole person.
Not separate from the student, not separate, but integral to that.
Integral to it, and how that waned, became really important, and then waned, and then became really important again. So, I didn't know that Birkbeck was a bank. Ravenscroft, I told you he saved us. Well, that's because he was a banker. Any bankers here? Because we need saving. I didn't know that we had a bank. I didn't know that we were a primary school, and a very radical primary school that Dickens takes the piss out of.
And the theatre as well.
And the theatre. We had the biggest theatre, university theatre in the country, and the best. So people like Pinero, the greatest playwright of the 19th century, sort of modernist theatre. He came to Birkbeck for one reason only. He came to Birkbeck to go to the theatre, our theatre. And we only lost our theatre when we moved here to the Mallet Street premises, which caused a huge controversy among students about all of a sudden our brilliant, great theatre just was disintegrate, just left. They built the building without a theatre. So there's those sorts of things that, I didn't expect. And just basic little things about how teaching changes.
Yes.
When we started, it was chalk, then it was pencil, then it was pens. Now people don't write at all. They just use their laptop. So things like that. Things like, for example, in science laboratories, the real problem with having women students, female students, was they wore corsets, and that caused real problems in experiments that are magnetic experiments. So what do? You can't do those experiments because they're all going crazy because women are wearing these big corsets. Women wore hats and gloves, and students and lecturers wore gowns, academic gowns to teach. Those sorts of things. Great people like, the whole look of the place has dramatically shifted, and how we teach has dramatically shifted.
And those directions of knowledge, one of the surprises for me was the paranormal at Birkbeck. So, whether that had anything to do with magnetics and corsets, I don't know. But
we were the heart of the paranormal science. In fact, one of the heart of paranormal science in the world. It was a really very, very big, not only, right from sort of the 1890s with spiritualism, but of course in much later period, really important in terms of paranormal science. The sort of Gala kids, Gala, we did experiments with Gala here at Birkbeck. And some of the top physicists in the world at the time were involved in this. We kind of, not some of us kind of sneer a little bit about paranormal sciences today, but at the time, this was a real important science that people like Bohm, one of the physicists who didn't get the Nobel Prize, really worked on, and Hasted and people like that. So there's all of these sort of unknown stories.
Yeah.
That I think are just really exciting and interesting, and gives a kind of flavour for who we are.
Well, what you do so brilliantly, I think, is use them to open up what Birkbeck's about and what it really is distinct about this place. I think
willing to push the envelope, push it a bit further than other places.
And that's partly, in a way, about the relationship with the University of London, isn't it? And this equivocal relationship. With the colleges that are around.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, we joined the University of London not in the 1920, but that was a great fight to become part of the University of London, because, the Kings in particular didn't want us because we were a great threat to King's College. Remember, at that time, we were just a few hundred yards, our building was a few hundred yards from King's College. So they were our great sort of enemy, and they didn't like us and we didn't like them, and we did some, they really fought against us becoming part of the University of London. But that, we became part of the University of London not because the management wanted it, but because our students really, really, really fought for it. George Armitage Smith, he is one of our masters, as they used to be called, who really, he's one of the heroes, I think, of my book. I grew to like this dour old Scotsman. But, he listened to the students, and the students wanted to become much more academic. They wanted to become part of the University of London and really push for that. So what he did when he became master in the 1890s, it took him a while to achieve this, is he started gradually making these reforms. So you see, one of the first things he did was, we used to have just lists of classes. So, you can do a class in this, a class in that, da-da-da-da-da-da. What he did was he grouped classes into faculties. So it looks more academic, okay? So you could do a degree in, or courses in the arts faculty, in the science, in laws, etc. Then what he did is he took to publishing publications in our annual reports. So again, sending out a message that we're not just teachers, we're doing really important research here. And so it was a slow process that he did, pushed on all the time by these students. Student body. And then, of course, when there was the Royal Commission looking into universities, he had all the evidences all set out there that actually we were publishing more and better than King's.
And it is that incredible, which is what I've loved about Birkbeck, is that incredibly rich intersection of scholarship and teaching. These aren't separate activities here.
No,
and that's deeply embedded in its history.
Really deeply embedded. And remember, this is a time when British universities generally were teaching institutions, unlike in continental Europe. So that emphasis on research is actually quite unique, and not totally unique, but it's different to the tradition that was, more common in the period. And if I can just say one more thing about anyone here from King's, I hope not. But the student, hello King's. But the students also, at the same time that they were pushing, we want to become part of the University of London. We're not, King's is part seminary, and we are, we are Quakers, we are atheists, we are Jews, we are nonconformists, etc., etc. But they also really liked ragging the King's students. So once a year, they would have what are called joy nights, where our students, I think we should revive this, by the way,
definitely.
Where our students would dress up. The boys would dress as girls. This is, by the way, this is 1890s through to the Second World War. Boys would dress as girls, girls would dress as babies, and boys, they would wear lipstick, they would have streamers and make loud noises, and they would parade down the streets, Fettes Lane. Everyone would come out to watch. It was a ceremonial thing of total carnivalesque riot. And they would then kidnap the speaker for the Foundation Day speaker. They would kidnap him in a restaurant, take him up Fettes Lane to the theatre, and then while he was speaking, they would interrupt, they would throw things, they would come on prams, adults, men dressed as babies with milk bottles. And they would do things like this, just crazy, and interrupt the speakers. Anyway, but what they also would do was they would rag the people in King's. And so they would go and throw flour and eggs and stuff like that. One year, however, 1928, it got out of hand. And they got seriously out of hand. People got broken bones and went to hospital and everything. So that kind of put a damper on this carnivalesque things. Yeah. But also, it shows, and this kind of joy nights was there for a limited period, 1890s to the 30s, because post-war, post-Second World War, austerity is not really a good time to throw flour and egg. And also students after the Second World War were much more serious. And this is one of the changes that students from the 40s onwards, particularly 50s onwards, wanted a degree, but they wanted a good degree. So there's a shift. And you see the shift also in our sporting culture, where we had this huge, one of the largest sporting grounds, I think it was the largest sporting grounds in Greenford, where a quarter of our students would go there every year to play sport. And you also see the decline of sports within the post-war student body, who are much more serious. There was this wonderful phrase they used to use. They used to distinguish between hares and rabbits. Hares were people who came, students and staff actually, who came to the college and hopped around all the different activities. So they went to classes, they went to sporting activities, they did debates, they did theatre, and really involved in the community. Rabbits were those who just hopped into class, hopped out at 9 o'clock. Okay, they sort of they were sustained by dry leaves of old textbooks, and they disdained the sexual antics of the hares. There's a lot of sex in the book, by the way.
Yeah, there really is. but it links back, doesn't it, to that? I mean, what I thought was really interesting was this idea of the kind of whole student and the sporting prowess and the drilling in wartime. This and the way in which this was kind of almost was imagined connecting up with academic achievement and progress.
Yeah, and you get the theorizing of that as well.
By the classicist. I can't remember his name now. But
Dakin. Yeah. You get and Wright. Yeah. I think you're thinking about Wright, actually. Yeah. And you get the sort of, well, what is it? What is a university for? Is it just for instrumental purposes? In other words, give people a better job? You can get this degree and you can get promoted. Is it instrumental? Or, in fact, are we trying to create a much more whole person, a person who can think critically, who can actually make real contributions to the society in which they live? And those are debates that actually continue throughout the whole period. And the emphasis is sometimes on one and sometimes on the other.
Yeah, but there's that really interesting, enduring sense of kind of social and political engagement in the college, which you could say about any university, but it's particularly striking, I think, amongst this.
It is particularly striking, and partly it's because of our, the nature of our student body, that they have always tended to be older than other universities, so they have a much stronger explicit investment in the wider society in which they are embedded. In fact, I've said this to you before, Matt, this is why I've loved working here at Birkbeck, precisely because, I came here as a naive sort of New Zealander, teaching British history to the Brits. So, I've had these incredible students who come to my classes, who've lived through some of the things I'm teaching. And that interaction, is really important. And that interaction has a history. I mean, the early days, and I didn't believe this when I started working on it. In the 1830s, the London Mechanics Institution was renowned for what they called mutual instruction. Okay? And mutual instruction, I wrote it down here. This is 1830s. London Mechanics Institute's members are active searchers after knowledge rather than passive recipients of the knowledge of others. That's 1830s.
Yeah,
I mean, that
incredible.
could be now. I mean, it is now. So that creates, I think, a very different dynamic and a very exciting one for us all.
And you capture it, Joanna. And I think it really is a brilliant book. And I'm going to invite you in a moment to join us for a glass of wine, to buy the book, to get Joanna's signature. But before I do, I wanted Joanna to have the last word rather than me. So she's going to read the very last page of the book, I think, giving it all away. This is the startling denouement.
I mean, Ramsay MacDonald was, of course, a student here at Birkbeck. And, he had this one, this is not the last page, but I'll get to it in a minute. Yeah. And he has this wonderful phrase where he says that Birkbeck is for people who are walled in by their occupations, and they use Birkbeck to adventure into wider fields of learning and opportunity. Absolutely. And this is why the subtitle of the book is called 200 Years of Radical Learning, not teaching, radical learning for working people. But the last paragraph is not the whole last paragraph because that's too long, but just a bit of it. This is why the chief reason for the transformative impact of Birkbeck has been the aspirations, needs, and desires of all its members. We have encountered many of them in this book. Most have been students and staff, but we've also met caterers, cooks, attendants, groundsmen, and inspectors of animal cages. Credit for the success of the college over 200 years must be given to Birkbeckians who have promoted intellectual curiosity and the cultivation of independent thinking. They have ensured that our premises provide forums for open debate where the public good can be served. Birkbeckians have taken care to produce, transform, enact, store, and disseminate knowledge in ways that are critical, ethical, politically aware, and responsive to the challenges of civil society. By creating free-thinking, independent, and culturally aware citizens of the globe, Birkbeck provides a basis for exploring the irreducible plurality of the human condition. This is the role that Birkbeck pursues as it moves into its third century of service to its members, students, communities, nation, and world.
Wonderful. Joanna, huge congratulations on a wonderful book. And do please join me in thanking Joanna for a really fascinating discussion about the college. Thank you. And its history, and come buy the book and have a glass of wine.